There is a tree the United States government once handed out for free, shipped to neighborhoods, planted along streets, promoted in suburban yards from Ohio to South Carolina. Today, that same tree is illegal to sell in multiple states. Officials will show up at your property, cut it down, and send you the bill. That is not a hypothetical. That is happening right now across the Midwest and South. And that tree is just one of 13 fruits on a list that can get your garden ripped out, your wallet drained, or in the worst cases, someone in your household hospitalized. Most gardeners have no idea these laws exist. They buy a plant at a nursery, accept a cutting from a neighbor, or let a volunteer seedling grow in the corner of the yard without thinking twice. Then an inspector shows up, or a neighbor reports it, or worse, a child eats something off a branch that looks perfectly harmless and ends up in an emergency room where doctors have no antidote. This is not fear-mongering. Every plant on this list is either restricted, regulated, or outright prohibited in parts of the United States for one of three specific reasons. Some are toxic enough to kill a person within hours. Some carry diseases that threaten billion-dollar agricultural industries. And some are invasive species, so aggressive they have already destroyed millions of acres of native habitat and are still spreading. The laws vary by state. The consequences do not. And the part that catches most gardeners off guard is this. Some of these plants look completely ordinary. You might already have one in your yard. You might have walked past one this morning without knowing what it was. By the time we are done, you will know exactly which ones to watch for, where the legal lines fall, which regions are most affected, and what to do if you find one growing on your property. Let me start with the ones that can put someone in the hospital, because these are the fruits where ignorance is not just expensive, it is dangerous. The first one catches people because it looks beautiful. Bright red pods that split open like a flower, revealing glossy black seeds nestled in creamy yellow flesh. This is ackee. It is the national fruit of Jamaica, a staple in Caribbean cooking, and one of the most tightly controlled fruits at every U.S. port of entry. The FDA bans the import of fresh ackee into the United States. Canned ackee that has been properly processed is legal. You can find it in Caribbean grocery stores. But fresh, whole ackee fruit cannot legally enter the country. The reason is a toxin called hypoglycin A. When ackee is unripe or improperly prepared, hypoglycin triggers a condition called Jamaican vomiting sickness. It starts with severe nausea. Then comes dangerously low blood sugar, seizures, and in serious cases, coma and death. There is no home test to determine whether a fresh ackee fruit is safe. The toxin concentration drops as the fruit ripens and opens naturally on the tree. But the window between toxic and safe is narrow and unpredictable. Even experienced growers in the Caribbean occasionally get it wrong. Now, to be clear, growing an ackee tree in your backyard is not a federal crime. The FDA ban targets importation, not cultivation. But in practice, ackee only grows in tropical climates: southern Florida, Hawaii, parts of the Gulf Coast. If you are in those areas and thinking about planting one, understand the liability. If someone picks an unripe fruit off your tree and gets sick, you are in serious legal territory. The risk is real enough that most knowledgeable gardeners in those regions avoid it entirely. But ackee at least warns you with its unusual appearance. The next fruit on this list looks like something you would hand to a child without thinking twice. Manchineel. The Spanish conquistadors called it manzanilla de la muerte, little apple of death. They were not being dramatic. They were being accurate. Manchineel produces small green fruits that look almost exactly like crab apples. They smell sweet. They have a pleasant, mildly fruity taste for the first few seconds. Then the burning starts. The throat swells. The lining of the mouth and esophagus blisters. Internal hemorrhaging can follow. There is no antidote. Emergency treatment is limited to managing symptoms and hoping the exposure was not severe enough to be fatal. But the fruit is not even the most dangerous part. Standing under a manchineel tree during rain can cause severe skin blistering because the sap washes down with the water. Touching the bark causes chemical burns. Burning the wood produces smoke that can cause temporary or permanent blindness. Every part of this tree is weaponized. Manchineel grows naturally in coastal areas of southern Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Authorities in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands mark known trees with red paint and warning signs in both English and Spanish. Tourism boards actively warn visitors to never seek shade under these trees, never touch the bark, and never pick the fruit. And every year, despite the warnings, tourists and local residents end up hospitalized because they did not know what they were looking at. If you encounter a manchineel tree on or near your property in southern Florida or the U.S. territories, do not attempt to remove it yourself. Contact your county agricultural extension office. They have protocols for safe handling. This is not a plant you manage with garden gloves and a handsaw. The third toxic fruit on this list is one most people consider completely harmless, because for most people, it is. Starfruit, carambola, that beautiful golden yellow fruit with the star-shaped cross-section that shows up in fruit salads and smoothie bowls. For a person with healthy kidneys, starfruit is perfectly safe. But for anyone with impaired kidney function, including early-stage kidney disease that has not yet been diagnosed, starfruit contains a neurotoxin called caramboxin that the kidneys cannot clear. The symptoms are deceptive. They start with persistent hiccups that will not stop, then confusion, then muscle weakness, seizures, and in severe cases, death. The medical literature documents cases where patients had no idea they had kidney problems, until a single serving of starfruit triggered a neurological crisis. In regions with large, elderly populations and high rates of undiagnosed kidney disease, parts of Texas, Arizona, and Florida, health authorities have issued specific warnings about starfruit consumption. Certain high-toxin starfruit varieties also face agricultural restrictions in citrus-producing states because they can harbor citrus greening disease, adding an economic dimension to the health concern. But the primary danger is medical, and it is specific enough that most people never hear about it until someone they know is affected. 3 fruits. 3 very different kinds of danger. And none of them look threatening at first glance. That is the pattern with the most dangerous plants. The harm is invisible until it is too late. But toxicity is only one of the 3 reasons fruits end up on restricted lists in the United States. The second category is quieter but economically devastating. Fruits that carry diseases capable of collapsing entire agricultural industries. And the history behind these bans includes some of the most dramatic policy reversals in American farming. One berry in particular was so popular in home gardens that the government promoted it nationwide before realizing what it was about to destroy. Black currants were everywhere in early 20th century America. Jams, jellies, pies, homemade wine. From Maine to Illinois, backyard bushes produced clusters of deep purple berries that families counted on every summer. The fruit was rich, tangy, packed with vitamin C, and almost effortless to grow. Nobody thought twice about planting them. Then the lumber industry nearly collapsed. Black currants, along with several other ribes species, serve as an alternate host for white pine blister rust, a fungal disease that is harmless to the currant bush, but devastating to white pine trees. The fungus needs both hosts to complete its life cycle. Without currants nearby, it cannot spread to pines. With them, it tears through forests. And in the early 1900s, white pine was not just a tree. It was the backbone of the construction and furniture industries across New England and the upper Midwest. Billions of board feet of lumber. Entire regional economies built on pine. In 1911, the federal government responded with a nationwide ban on growing ribes species, including black currants. The eradication campaign was aggressive. Inspectors went door to door through farming communities, ripping out bushes that families had tended for generations. Millions of plants were destroyed. Black currants vanished from American gardens almost overnight. An entire fruit disappeared from the national diet so completely that most Americans born after 1940 have never tasted one. Now here is where the story gets more nuanced than the original ban suggests. The federal prohibition was lifted in 1966. The decision was handed back to individual states. Today, black currants are legal to grow in most of the country, but several states in the Northeast, where white pine forests remain economically critical, still maintain restrictions. New York lifted its ban in 2003, but requires growers to plant only rust-resistant cultivars. Maine, New Hampshire, and parts of Massachusetts still prohibit them outright or require special permits. If you are in the Northeast and considering black currants, check your state's specific regulations before ordering plants. Your local cooperative extension office can tell you exactly what is allowed in your county. The irony is thick. A fruit that was once in every American kitchen is now so forgotten that most people do not even recognize the name. And the disease it carries, white pine blister rust, is still active in parts of the Northeast. The restrictions are not arbitrary. They exist because the threat has not disappeared. But resistant cultivars are making a slow comeback, and in most states, growing black currants is perfectly legal again. The key is knowing which side of the line your state falls on. The second disease-carrying fruit on this list triggered an even larger eradication campaign, one that stretched across the entire wheat belt and lasted decades. Common barberry. Those neat ornamental shrubs with bright red berries that hang through winter, once valued for their tartness in preserves and their high vitamin C content. What nobody advertised was that common barberry is the primary alternate host for wheat stem rust, a fungal disease capable of reducing wheat yields by 70% or more in a bad outbreak year. Wheat is not a regional crop. It is a national food supply. In the early 20th century, when America's wheat production fed the country and supported massive exports, wheat stem rust was treated as a matter of national security. The federal government launched one of the most aggressive plant eradication programs in American history. Inspectors fanned out across Michigan, Montana, the Dakotas, New Hampshire, and every major wheat-producing region. Common barberry bushes were destroyed by the millions. Criminal penalties were imposed for possession. Those bans remain active today in key agricultural states. And there is a wrinkle that catches modern gardeners off guard. Japanese barberry, a different species commonly sold in garden centers as an ornamental, looks similar to common barberry. Homeowners confuse the two regularly. If you have a barberry shrub on your property in a wheat-producing state, it is worth confirming the species. Your county extension office can help identify it. The consequences of having the wrong one are not trivial. Fines and mandatory removal are standard enforcement in states where wheat stem rust remains a concern. The third fruit in this disease category operates differently from the first two, and the misinformation around it is widespread enough to be worth addressing directly. Trifoliate orange. A thorny, cold-hardy citrus relative that produces small, fuzzy, extremely sour fruits. You will occasionally see online claims that trifoliate orange is banned across the entire South. That is not accurate. Here is what is true. Trifoliate orange can harbor citrus canker and citrus greening disease, two of the most destructive pathogens facing commercial citrus production. Florida alone accounts for roughly 70% of America's orange juice. The economic stakes are measured in billions. Any plant that can silently carry these diseases within range of commercial groves represents a genuine threat. What makes trifoliate orange particularly tricky is that the tree itself is highly resistant to these diseases. It often shows no visible symptoms of infection while actively spreading pathogens to vulnerable commercial citrus nearby. This is why citrus-producing states, Florida, Texas, parts of California, and portions of the Gulf Coast, impose strict regulations on moving citrus plant material, including trifoliate orange, across quarantine boundaries. It is not that the tree is illegal everywhere. It is that transporting it into or within designated citrus protection zones can violate USDA and state quarantine regulations. Adding to the problem, trifoliate orange has 3-inch spines, hard, sharp, and capable of puncturing tires. In areas where it has naturalized, land becomes difficult to work. Wildlife spreads the seeds, and established trees are extremely difficult to remove. If you are anywhere near commercial citrus production and you see what looks like a small, thorny, wild-growing citrus tree, the smartest move is to contact your county agricultural extension before doing anything else. They will identify it and advise you on next steps. 3 fruits that carry diseases. 3 industries, lumber, wheat, and citrus, worth billions of dollars combined. And in every case, the pattern is the same. The plant itself looks harmless. It grows easily. It produces fruit that seems unremarkable, but the pathogen it hosts can devastate an entire sector of the economy if it reaches the wrong place at the wrong time. These bans exist not because the government is overreaching, but because the economic damage from a single outbreak can be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of lost jobs. That brings us to the third and largest category on this list: the invasive species. 7 fruits that were introduced to America deliberately, in some cases promoted by the very agencies now spending millions to eradicate them, and have since escaped into wild landscapes where they are destroying native ecosystems on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. These are not theoretical threats. They are actively reshaping forests, riverbanks, and farmland across the country right now. And the most dramatic example, the one that perfectly captures how a good intention turns into an ecological disaster, is a tree with beautiful white blossoms that was once considered the ideal ornamental for American suburbs. The Callery pear looked perfect on paper, fast-growing, pest-resistant, disease-resistant, covered in white blossoms every spring. In the 1960s and 70s, the USDA actively promoted it. Municipalities planted it along streets. Nurseries sold millions. Homeowners loved it as a low-maintenance ornamental that made any yard look polished. It was the suburban dream tree. Nobody anticipated what would happen when birds started eating the small, hard fruits and spreading seeds into wild areas. Callery pears escaped cultivation. And once they did, the tree revealed a side that no promotional brochure had mentioned. In the wild, Callery pears grow dense, thorny, and aggressive. They form impenetrable thickets across open land, crowding out native trees, native shrubs, and native grasses. The thorns are not decorative. They are rigid, sharp, and long enough to puncture tractor tires and damage expensive farm equipment. Entire sections of farmland in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina have become unusable because Callery pear thickets are too dense and too well-armed to clear without heavy machinery. The policy reversal has been swift and expensive. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina now prohibit the sale and planting of Callery pears entirely. Nurseries cannot stock them. Gardeners cannot plant them. If you already have one on your property in a banned state, officials strongly encourage removal, and in some jurisdictions they will remove it themselves and bill you for the service. The same agricultural departments that once distributed this tree for free are now spending millions trying to undo what they started. If this story sounds like a cautionary tale, it is, and it is not the only one. 6 more invasive fruit-bearing plants have followed the same trajectory, introduced with good intentions, promoted widely, and then recognized too late as ecological disasters. Each one is now banned or restricted in multiple states, and each one is still actively spreading. Autumn olive was brought to the United States from Asia in the mid-20th century for erosion control and wildlife habitat. It seemed ideal, hardy, fast-growing, tolerant of poor soil. Government agencies planted it by the thousands along highways, mine reclamation sites, and conservation areas. The problem emerged when researchers quantified what a single plant could do. One autumn olive bush produces up to 200,000 berries per year. Birds eat them and spread seeds for miles in every direction. Within a few years, hillsides that once supported diverse native plant communities become solid walls of autumn olive. But autumn olive does not just outcompete native plants through sheer volume. It changes the soil itself. This shrub fixes atmospheric nitrogen, altering the soil chemistry in ways that native species, adapted over thousands of years to the specific nutrient conditions of American forests, simply cannot tolerate. The native plants die. The autumn olive expands. The ecosystem does not just shift, it collapses. Connecticut, Wisconsin, Virginia, and a growing list of other states have made it illegal to sell or plant autumn olive, with mandatory removal orders and fines for property owners who allow it to persist. In the Pacific Northwest, a different invader has been reshaping the landscape for decades, with even more physical aggression. Himalayan blackberry. The berries are enormous, 3 times the size of native blackberries, and they taste incredible. That is precisely why they were introduced in the late 1800s as a superior fruiting crop. What nobody accounted for was the growth rate. Himalayan blackberry canes can extend 20 feet in a single season. They root wherever a cane tip touches the ground, spawning entirely new plants. Thickets reach 15 feet tall, armed with thorns thick and sharp enough to puncture tractor tires. In rural Oregon and Washington, entire abandoned homesteads have disappeared under Himalayan blackberry within a decade. Not partially obscured, gone. Buildings, fences, vehicles, swallowed. Livestock cannot graze near infested areas. Farmers cannot reclaim invaded land without specialized equipment and significant expense. Oregon State University estimates that millions of dollars are spent annually attempting to control Himalayan blackberry across the Pacific Northwest, and the plant continues to gain ground faster than eradication efforts can contain it. Oregon, Washington, and Idaho all classify it as a noxious weed with various levels of restriction on deliberate planting. Now shift to the American West, where the most valuable resource is not soil or sunlight, it is water. Russian olive was introduced in the 1800s as a windbreak and ornamental. Silvery leaves, small yellowish fruits, tolerant of drought. It seemed made for the dry landscapes of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. But Russian olive established itself along riverbanks and streams, the exact corridors where water is most critical, and it drinks roughly 3 times as much water as the native willows and cottonwoods it displaces. In a region where every gallon of water is allocated, fought over, and legally protected, that level of consumption is not just an ecological problem, it is an economic crisis. Ranchers watch irrigation flows drop. Streams that fed livestock for generations run thin or dry up entirely. Russian olive also practices allelopathy. It releases chemicals into the soil that inhibit the growth of surrounding vegetation, creating barren zones where nothing else can survive. Colorado and Wyoming have banned the tree entirely. If authorities find Russian olive on your property in these states, they will remove it and charge you for the work. The enforcement is strict because the stakes, water supply for agriculture, ranching, and human communities, are existential in arid landscapes. Moving east and north, buckthorn has quietly conquered the understory of forests across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Massachusetts. The strategy is elegant and devastating. Buckthorn leafs out in spring weeks before native plants wake up, capturing sunlight while everything else is still dormant. It holds its leaves later into autumn, extending its growing season at both ends. The berries contain a natural laxative that speeds passage through birds, ensuring seeds are spread rapidly across wide areas. And once established, buckthorn releases allelopathic compounds into the soil that actively prevent native plants from germinating. The result is visible across millions of acres of Midwestern and Northeastern forest. Dense, dark monocultures of buckthorn, where wildflowers, native shrubs, and young trees once grew. The ecological damage extends up the food chain. Native insects cannot feed on buckthorn leaves, which means insect populations crash, which means the bird species that depend on those insects lose their food supply. Forest biodiversity drops sharply in invaded areas. States across the upper Midwest and Northeast have classified buckthorn as a prohibited invasive species, with mandatory removal requirements and penalties for property owners who fail to comply. And finally, the one that might be growing in more American yards than any other plant on this list, without anyone realizing it, is banned: privet. For decades, privet hedges were the symbol of tidy suburban landscaping. Neat rows lining driveways, framing front yards, separating properties. Fragrant white flowers in spring. Clusters of small, dark berries in autumn. Millions of American homeowners planted privet because it was cheap, fast-growing, and easy to shape. What those homeowners did not know, and what took wildlife biologists decades to quantify, is that privet berries spread relentlessly through bird droppings. An escaped privet has now invaded over 1 million acres of forest across the American South. In affected areas, plant diversity drops by 90%. Native wildflowers disappear. Young native trees cannot establish. And because native insects cannot feed on privet foliage, bird populations in invaded forests decline by up to 80% compared to healthy native woodland. Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina now list privet as a prohibited invasive species, and removal efforts cost southern states tens of millions of dollars annually. If you have a privet hedge on your property in one of these states, it is worth checking your local invasive species list. You may not be required to remove an existing hedge in every jurisdiction, but planting new privet is prohibited in an expanding number of counties and municipalities across the Southeast. 7 invasive species, 7 plants that were introduced deliberately, promoted widely, and are now the subject of expensive, often losing battles to contain. The pattern is consistent enough to be its own lesson. A plant that seems like a gift in the first decade can become a curse in the second. And that pattern leads to the most practical question this entire list raises. What should you actually do with this information? Knowing the list is only useful if you know what to do with it. So let me walk through the practical steps that actually protect your garden, your wallet, and your property. First, and this is the step most people skip, check your state's invasive species list before you plant anything unfamiliar. Every state maintains one. Most are available online through your state's Department of Agriculture or Department of Natural Resources website. These lists are updated regularly, and they are specific to your region. A plant that is perfectly legal in Georgia might be prohibited in Tennessee. A shrub you can buy at a nursery in California might carry a mandatory removal order in Colorado. The laws are state by state, sometimes county by county, and assuming that something sold at a garden center is automatically legal on your property is a mistake that has cost homeowners thousands of dollars in fines and forced removal. Second, if you find something on your property that you cannot identify with certainty, contact your local cooperative extension office before you act. Extension offices exist in nearly every county in the United States. They are staffed by people trained in plant identification, regional agriculture, and local regulations. The service is usually free. A phone call or an email with a clear photograph can save you from making a costly decision in either direction, removing something that was harmless or leaving something that needed to come out immediately. For plants with disease implications, anything in the citrus, ribes, or barberry families, extension agents can also connect you with state agricultural inspectors who handle quarantine issues. Third, do not attempt to remove manchineel or large infestations of thorny invasives like Himalayan blackberry or Callery pear on your own. Manchineel requires professional handling due to the extreme toxicity of every part of the tree. Thorny invasives require heavy equipment for anything beyond a small patch. Attempting manual removal of a mature Himalayan blackberry thicket or a dense stand of Callery pear without proper gear and machinery is a fast way to get injured. County agencies in heavily affected areas often have cost-share programs or removal assistance for invasive species on private land. Ask your extension office whether your state or county offers any support before you spend money hiring a private contractor. Fourth, if you are in a citrus-producing region, Florida, Texas, Southern California, or the Gulf Coast, be extremely careful about moving any citrus plant material across county or quarantine lines. The USDA and state departments of agriculture maintain active citrus quarantine zones designed to slow the spread of citrus canker and citrus greening disease. This includes trifoliate orange, which is widely used as commercial rootstock, but is regulated in terms of transport and planting near commercial groves. If you are unsure whether your property falls within a quarantine area, your county agricultural commissioner can confirm in minutes. Violating citrus quarantine regulations carries significant federal and state penalties, and enforcement is active. Fifth, and this is the one that applies to almost every gardener in America, learn what is already growing on your property. This sounds obvious, but it is the gap where most problems start. Buckthorn looks like a dozen other native shrubs to an untrained eye. Privet hedges have been in yards so long that many homeowners assume they are native plants. Autumn olive grows along roadsides and field edges so commonly in parts of the Midwest that people mistake it for part of the natural landscape. A single afternoon spent walking your property with a field guide or a plant identification app and cross-referencing anything suspicious against your state's invasive species list is the cheapest insurance you can buy against a surprise removal order or a fine you never saw coming. Now, I want to put this entire list into perspective, because the goal here is not to make anyone afraid of their garden. It is the opposite. The goal is to make you a more informed grower who plants with confidence, because you know what belongs in your yard and what does not. Out of the 13 fruits on this list, most American gardeners will only ever encounter 2 or 3 in their specific region. If you are in the upper Midwest, buckthorn and autumn olive are the ones to watch. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, Himalayan blackberry is the dominant concern. If you are in the Southeast, privet and Callery pear are the species most likely to show up on your property or your neighbors. If you are in the arid West, Russian olive is the primary threat. If you are in citrus country, trifoliate orange and the quarantine regulations around it are what matter most. And the toxic species, ackee, manchineel, and starfruit, are relevant only in tropical and subtropical zones, primarily southern Florida, Hawaii, and the U.S. territories. The common thread across all 13 is that the damage happens when people do not know what they are planting or what is already growing around them. Every one of these situations is preventable with basic awareness and a 5-minute check before a new plant goes in the ground. And here is the part that deserves a more honest conversation than most gardening channels are willing to have. Some of these plants produce genuinely good fruit. Himalayan blackberries are delicious. Autumn olive berries are loaded with antioxidants. Black currants make some of the finest preserves you will ever taste. The fact that a plant is invasive or regulated does not mean it is worthless. It means it is in the wrong place. The restrictions exist because the cost of allowing these species to spread unchecked, ecological damage, agricultural losses, water depletion, biodiversity collapse, is measured in billions of dollars and generations of environmental recovery. For every banned or restricted fruit, there are legal, well-adapted alternatives that can fill the same role in your garden without the risk. Native blackberry cultivars, bred for size and flavor, can replace Himalayan blackberry in the Pacific Northwest. Rust-resistant black currant varieties are now legal in most states and produce excellent fruit. Native elderberry, serviceberry, and pawpaw offer remarkable flavor and nutrition with zero invasive risk. If you want potassium-rich fruiting plants, a comfrey patch along your garden border feeds every fruit crop you grow without ever showing up on a restricted list. There is always a better option that keeps you legal, keeps your ecosystem intact, and still fills the harvest basket. The gardeners who run into trouble are almost never the ones trying to break the law. They are the ones who did not know the law existed. They inherited a barberry bush from a grandmother's garden. They let a volunteer Callery pear grow in the back corner because the blossoms were pretty. They bought a privet hedge at a garden center before their state added it to the prohibited list. The pattern is always the same: a well-meaning gardener, an unfamiliar regulation, and a preventable consequence. The fix is simple. Before you plant anything new, especially anything you received as a gift, found growing wild, or bought from an online seller outside your state, spend 5 minutes checking your state's invasive species list and your county's agricultural regulations. One phone call to your extension office. One quick search on your State Department of Agriculture website. That is all it takes to plant with confidence instead of planting and hoping nothing goes wrong. Your garden should be a place that feeds you, not a legal liability you did not see coming. And the difference between those two outcomes is not luck. It is knowing what is on the list before the list finds you. If this helped you see your garden differently, or if it made you want to check what is actually growing in your yard, type "grow" in the comments and hit the like button. It helps more gardeners find this before they make a mistake nobody warned them about. And if you already know of a banned or invasive species growing in your area, drop your state in the comments. I want to hear what you are seeing on the ground, because the real enforcement picture in this country looks different county by county. And this community learns fastest when people share what is actually happening where they live.